Welcome to Barnaby's podcast, Eye of the Beholder. Barnaby's is one of the leading search engines for art, design, antiques and collectibles from over 3,000 auction houses worldwide. We aim to make the art and auction market more transparent and accessible to everyone, from beginners to collectors and professionals. Alexandre Ghotbi, welcome to Barnaby's podcast, Eye of the Beholder. In this week's episode, we will talk about what I guess you love most, except your family, of course, watches. It seems to be that the whole world are collecting watches nowadays, but my first question to you still have to be, why watches? How did it all start for you?
Oh, well, Pontus, first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be with you. Why watches? Vast question. I think it also actually started with my first Swatch watch that in the early 1980s. My parents had gone to Switzerland and came back with a Swatch, and it was the coolest thing in the world. And all of a sudden, everybody in my class had a Swatch, and we were trading them, and there were different colors, and it was just such a cool object to have on your wrist. And little by little, I just, as I grew up, I started looking into watches more and more. It was just something it was a hobby. I was fascinated by watches. And then I'll tell you an interesting story about watches that had an increasingly important impact on my career. I started off as a lawyer. I was trained as a lawyer. I studied as a lawyer, and the first job I accepted as a lawyer wasn't the best firm or the one that paid the most or was the most prestigious. It was to the place I went where I had all my interviews with the partner I was supposed to work with, and every time he had a super cool new watch. And I told myself, never will I be this close to these amazing watches, so I chose that job. I stayed only 6 months. It was not a good career choice, but the watches were great. Ever since I've been into watches, yeah.
Yeah, but so the interest was actually, you had interest already before. You started at the law firm, obviously. Yeah, so you spotted that well. Yeah. So, but that's true. Many experts at auction houses start a career by studying in art school. They become assistants and they walk their way up to maybe one day, hopefully, and if they're lucky and work hard, become senior experts. But you obviously took another path. As you said, you were a lawyer before. But how come you were kind of invited to Phillips?
Well, contrary to art, there's no watch school where you go and learn about watches and the history of watches to become a watch expert. So basically, it just comes out of personal passion and research. So that's how a lot of people you see in the watch departments just come from totally different backgrounds. I ended up in the early 2000s. I had started with a friend of mine. I was a co-founder of a watch discussion forum called The Purists, which is now called Purists Pro, which was one of the first. I would say it's like a social media dedicated to watches, way before social media as we know it today existed. That allowed me to start doing some consultancy for brands in terms of digital, in terms of client marketing, etc. And one day in 2000 and end of 2007, early 2008, Vacheron Constantin calls me up and says, Alex, would you want to come and work for us full-time, set up digital, set up CRM, and take it from there? And it was a 1.5 second decision for me. I said yes. So I moved from Paris with my family. We went to Geneva, worked for Vacheron for 7-8 years. And then at one point, I had met the guys at Phillips who were starting. They had already had their first sale in Geneva. And they asked me if I wanted to come and join the Geneva team, which was building. And in 2016, early 2016, I joined Phillips as a specialist, and just moved up to now head of Europe and Middle East.
And I must ask you, I mean, you are head of watches for Continental Europe and the Middle East at Phillips, the world's most prestigious auction house when it comes to vintage watches. But what different collecting behavior do you see between the markets and the continent?
To be honest, not that much anymore. A few years ago, I would have said there was a very specific collecting pattern, for example, in Asia, where clients were looking more for modern watches, gem set watches. The US was very Patek and Rolex oriented, and Europe was very vintage. And the Middle East 6 years ago didn't hardly exist in terms of the secondary markets at auction. Today, the tastes are more or less standardized. You will have Richard Milles and gem set watches selling very well in Geneva, and Hong Kong will have amazing vintage watches, etc. So the tastes have become harmonized in terms of, I wouldn't even say harmonized, because the tastes are so varied today. 10 years, 20 years ago, people were only collecting Patek and Rolex. Today, Patek, Rolex, Vacheron, Richard Mille, Roger Smith, Carré Voutilainen, MB&F, so Cartier. So the taste has become the market has become much wider, much deeper, and I don't really see much more of a difference between the Middle Eastern, the European, the Asian or the American markets.
That's interesting. But historically, I would like to say that most collectors in general have been men. But in recent years, more and more women have started collecting precious wristwatches. What are the main differences in taste between men and women? And has it changed in the latest year because of gender fluidity?
So to be honest, we don't have that many female collectors, at least at the auction level. I think that comes from one fact, is that for years, the female watches were basically smaller sized men's watches with diamonds on them. And I think that lack of creativity, we sell watches that have already been made. We're the secondary market. And I think until brands actually come out with incredible watches that are dedicated for ladies, we won't see those watches. We won't see lady collectors. I think one brand that is doing a fantastic job is, for example, Van Cleef & Arpels with their Poetic Complications. And maybe in 10, 15 years, these will be among the best sellers that we'll have at auction. But you were talking about gender fluidity. For many years, we always thought that gem set watches were for women. But today you see with increasing desire for gem set Rolexes or Pateks, large size watches that are being bought by men. And that is a huge. Look at the Rolex Rainbow. It's a large watch, which is mostly more worn by men than women.
And once again, that's a global trend, you would say?
So very surprisingly, the gem set watches, they're still very much going to Europe and the Americas, which are the more modern, mature markets, because they've been around longer.
But if we travel back in time, at least as far as I know, collectors were driven by learning as much as possible and used to be full of knowledge in a certain topic. Watch and clock collectors was no exception, as far as I know. But how important is knowledge today among the collectors? Because you mentioned that it is a broader variety today, isn't it? But does it have to do with the knowledge? People know more?
Well, it's interesting. I would say the market today is split in two. There are those who just want to have a watch that everybody else has, and they have no clue what the history of the brand, the proprieties of the specific watch, the pros, the cons, etc. Then you have those who really want to go deep. And which is fascinating is 20 years ago, if you were a watch specialist, you had to read books and go to watch fairs and look at watches. Today, you go online and immediately you have access to a lot of information. Now, the big difficulty is when you're doing your research is to make sure that that source of information is correct. Because, you know, anybody can just go post whatever they feel like posting. That doesn't make it true. So there's a vast number of, there's a vastness in the available information, but you need to pick carefully. And I think that's where we, the specialists at auction houses, come to help. Is that our job is also educating? I think is a big word, but I think our job is to try to steer the people who are interested, the connoisseurs, the enthusiasts, into the right direction, at least to give them the basis for them also to be able to do their own research. But we have to pick and choose on the information that is available, on what is the correct information and what is an incorrect information.
Now we talked about the information, but what about the watches itself? Because when something increases in value, the risk of fakes and frauds also increases, right? So how do you spot a fake, or is it even possible today?
I think to be able to spot a fake, you have to have seen hundreds, if not thousands, of watches. You know, you have an eye. I would be incapable of drinking Petrus wine and knowing if it's a real one or not a real one, because, you know, if it's the first or second time I'm drinking one, I can't compare. But a sommelier who knows exactly the flavor, the smell, etc. of that wine from that period will know how if it's a good or a wrong one. And it's the same thing with watches. It's everything. It's like with everything. It's a question of experience. And experience comes with time, with age, and seeing thousands and thousands and thousands of watches in your lifetime.
And it becomes like a sixth sense almost.
Exactly. But however, there's one good takeaway, or something that gives away that something is fake, is if the price is really way too good to be true. If it's too good to be true, then it's not.
You said you started with Swatch watches. How did your taste develop, or at least change over time?
I think, you know, tastes change over time, but there's been two things that seem to have always guided me in my watch taste. One was vintage watches. I've always been attracted to vintage. Obviously, the vintage of when I was in the 90s, what was vintage is not the same as in the 2020s. Today, a watch made in the 1990s can be considered vintage. In the 1990s, when I started getting interested in watches, it was a modern watch. So it was always vintage and independent makers. I remember one of my very first nice wristwatches bought with my first paycheck was a Daniel Roth, because I was and this was in the mid 1990s. I think my taste has changed. It hasn't been as much the taste, but the eye, looking for, and when it's vintage, for the condition, making sure everything is original, and I think just not buying into hype or the marketing spiel that brands are trying to sell you. It's forging your own character. Yeah, I think that's what has changed the most. But I still love the things I loved 20 years ago. So I think I may be quite boring in that sense, where I haven't gone from exactly. I haven't gone from one side to and totally changing.
No. I think that's good though. At Barnaby's, one of our most searched globally is Rolex. Just a bit after comes Omega and Patek Phillipe as well. They've all become some of the most famous brands in the world. How come you think they are so strong brands?
Well, I think Rolex is... Rolex, they basically invented everything in terms of sports watches. They invented the dive watch. When you think of a dive watch, you think of a Submariner. You think of a chronograph. You think of a Daytona. You think of a day-date model. It's the Oyster day-date. So I think they have consistently come out with iconic designs, which they've stuck to. The Submariner is 60 years old. The Daytona is 60 years old. The GMTs are 60. I mean, every watch that Rolex brought out in the 50s is still there. It has slightly with small evolution. So there is an immediate design language that they've kept to, and it's gone into people's minds. And I think they seriously make the best watch in the world. I'm not a Rolex guy, but you buy a Rolex, you service it every 50 years, it'll continue functioning. It's a fantastic tool watch. Same with Omega. Omega was considered a very high-end brand in the 1940s, 50s, and then it's starting the 60s, 70s that they started also competing with Rolex. So the two of them have been on the same, and they each make almost 1 million watches. So that there's a lot going there. Yeah. And then Patek, I think what really exploded was in the 80s when they decided to start buying back their own watches at auctions and creating their museum. And they brought out, I think, more, as we talk about information, there was more information about the brand. They were having a museum. You had more and more in catalogs, and people trust pieces and watches where there's information available. And once again, Patek has been making watches with a specific DNA or design language ever since the 40s when they became really big, and you recognize it. And I think it's comforting for people to see continuity. If the brand keeps changing their designs, their look, their price segment, etc., you don't know where to look at. It's comforting to see that basically what all these brands that you've mentioned have in common is continuity and harmony in what they've been doing. Everything makes sense. You recognize it.
Yeah. But what is most important for you then? Is it the brand, the technique, or the design, or who wore the watch? Or
you mean personally, my taste, or what we take it at auction?
For you personally.
I think for me, what's most important is both. It has the technical aspect is very important. I like watches, so I like watchmaking. But the design is also very important because you look at your watch probably 20, 30 times an hour. You never know what time it is, but you just keep looking at the design. And that design has to be pleasing to the eye. The brand, I don't really care, to be honest. I just have to feel that there's a certain honesty and originality in the watch.
I mean, obviously those great brands, you sell quite a lot of watches from them, but you had some exceptional pieces now recently by George Daniels. Who was George Daniels?
So George Daniels is probably a watchmaker that nobody had heard of until a couple of years ago. He is the grandfather of independent watchmaking. He is the first watchmaker who decided, to create a watch and put his name on it. And this is in the late 1960s. Before that, watchmakers, went and worked for watch brands. They didn't make watches with their name on them. And he made a series of unique pocket watches. Then in the 1990s, he made 2 wristwatches. He's made 27 unique pocket watches, 2 unique wristwatches. And then with his apprentice, Roger Smith, he made a series of watches in series, but 36 pieces or 48 pieces. There's less than 150 watches with George Daniels' name on the dial. I mean, that's less than Modigliani paintings. And today, collectors are looking for unique pieces. They're looking for traditional watchmaking, and they're looking for rarity and originality. And George Daniels has all these elements, and that's why every time there's a piece that shows up on the market, they get snapped. We had a piece, a unique tourbillon double-sided that you had seen when we were in
I did
in Copenhagen and Stockholm. It sold that was his personal watch. It sold for 4 million Swiss francs, which sounds like a lot of money for a watch, but whoever bought it, I think, got a good deal, and in a few years when the watch will come back, or maybe in 10 years when the watch will come back, it will do much better.
But what was so fantastic about that watch? He owned it himself, so that must be has been his favorite, I guess, or.
Yeah, I mean, once again, we go back to an artist. Imagine Modigliani, who's one of my favorite artists. That's why I keep mentioning him. Imagine he paints something and he decides to put it up in his living room because he likes it so much. And Daniels, he loved that watch. It was his first. It was actually the second wristwatch he made, and it was interesting because in the front it just had the time, hours, minutes, seconds, and a power reserve, and on the back you had a tourbillon with the day and date. You're not going to take off your watch every time to see what the day and date are. So there was a little button on the side of the case, and the case flipped open, and you could see the day and date, and then you could just gently flip it back and wear it. It's a very handmade watch. When you look at it, you see that it is made by hand. There's the errors and the beauty of handmade. And George Daniels, what's incredible is the man. He never actually had a formal education, training as watchmaker. He was an auto self-taught watchmaker, and he's today now considered one of the greatest watchmakers of the 20th century.
Oh yeah, and you were. I mean, that this was kind of a record, I guess, for an independent watch, or.
Actually, it's the second highest we've had for an independent watchmaker. The first being we had a watch that we sold a year before, which was a Philippe Dufour Grande et Petite Sonnerie. It's the very first Grande and Petite Sonnerie wristwatch ever made. So today, collectors are there to buying pieces by watchmakers where the majority of the watch buying public haven't heard of. So, but that shows the beauty of the market, where people are ready to pay something for their historical or technical relevance and not the brand name.
I mean, those watches are sold for millions, and the last decade the price for watches has just increased like crazy. And this spring you had what we in the auction industry call another season with white gloves auction, when you sell every single items. But for how long do you think this will continue with this enormous market for watches, for enormous prices?
The watch market has been going up steadily since the 1990s. But nobody was paying attention to it because everybody thought that watch collectors were a bunch of geeks, which maybe they are, maybe they're not. But watches have become, I think, during time, very similar to artworks. Nobody considers buying art as niche, as geeky. And I think watches in the past 7, 8, 10 years have entered the same field, or been considered as true works of art, or at least artisanship, in the same level as paintings or automobiles, or vintage automobiles. And obviously in the past 30 years, the watch market has gone up. Within the watch market, it's not the same models. What was selling very well 20 years ago may not be selling as well today, and what was not selling 20 years ago are the best sellers today. So within the market, the type of piece or the type of watch goes up and down, but the watch market, or the secondary watch market, it just hasn't stopped. And you have also a younger generation that's coming to the market. We're talking about 20-year, 25, 30-year-old self-made businessmen, or the next generation taking care of the family business, who are coming to the market. And as you said, originally the watch market was white male European and Americans, but who are 50 plus. And today you have guys from the Emirates, from Kuwait, from Saudi Arabia, from China, from Vietnam, from Indonesia, from Malaysia. So the market has become much wider and much deeper and much younger.
You might be tired of this question, but for me, the watch market really took off, or at least became a public affair, in connection with the sale of the style icon Paul Newman's Rolex Daytona. regardless of whether that was a starting point, you were paid insanely well for that wristwatch in those days. How much does the provenance matter for the price?
It's huge, but depends what kind of provenance. A year before we sold the Paul Newman, we also sold a steel Patek Phillipe 1518 from the 1940s, only one of only 4 made, and it was the first vintage wristwatch to go above 10 million. Actually went 11 million. So that had a big impact. But the Paul Newman, it ticked a lot of boxes. The Rolex Paul Newman was called the Paul Newman because the famous actor was wearing that watch, which is a Daytona with a special dial, called officially the exotic dial. And it's the Rolex Paul Newman, which is, scholars consider to be the first watch that started the vintage watch collecting trend. And here you had the watch of Paul Newman, who gave its name to this model and to also start the whole. I mean, it's historically extremely important. We had a watch from Marlon Brando the year later, and no disrespect to Paul Newman, but I think Marlon Brando is a greater actor. He had a GMT that he wore. It was his personal watch that he had worn in Apocalypse Now, which sold for $2 million, which is a lot of money. But that watch that he was wearing the value was just because it was Marlon Brando's. It's not the watch, was never called the Marlon Brando, and it's not the watch that started a specific trend. So I think the Paul Newman is really something apart. But provenance, obviously, we've had, I told you, the Marlon Brando watch. We've had watches worn by Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man, the Noirwerk, which had special features, which sells for 10 times its retail value. So provenance always has an impact, has a positive impact. If the wearer has some kind of celebrity status.
There is a saying, show me your bookshelf and I tell you who you are. Is it the same with watches? Can you reveal a person by looking at the watch?
I think, yes, you can. But today, it's become so varied. You can see somebody wearing, a moon swatch on the weekend, then $3 million, Patek in the evening, and the next day a Rolex Modern, and then the third day an independent watchmaker. I think it's becoming more and more difficult because people themselves and their tastes and the way they wear their watches are becoming more and more varied. A few years ago, once again, you had the sports guys who wore Rolexes and Omegas, and then the classical guys who wore Pateks, Vacherons, and Audemars. Today, everything is mixed, but you see that even, in the way people dress. You can wear a suit with sneakers. You can wear, a Zara shirt with a 2,000 euro pair of shoes. So everything is mixing, and I think this is what's fabulous today. Is like it's not a question of changing personalities, but it's pick and choosing in variety, and that's I think a fantastic. Fantastic thing. So the way of saying, yes, you can know somebody by the watches they wear. Yes, and the specific watch. Not, I won't say it's like if somebody's wearing a Rolex, but if they're wearing a specific Rolex or wearing a specific Patek or a specific jaune, there you can more or less see their kind of taste. But it's becoming a more muddled up, I would say.
My last question, if you take a deep look in the crystal ball, what does it tell you? I mean about the trends.
It's always difficult to predict trends, but I was speaking to a friend of mine or somebody I knew whose job is to predict future tastes. And I asked her, like, how, I mean, how is that possible? And she gave me a very simple answer, which I'll give to you, which I think totally works. She's like, people want tomorrow what they don't want today. It's a pendulum. So everybody wants the same thing in one day, and nobody wants, let's say, vintage dress watches. Today they're very difficult to sell. Everybody wants sports watches. But maybe in 5-6 years' time, people are sick and tired of seeing sports watches, and they want to go to more elegant dress watches. And once they go into dress watches, they'll want maybe complicated pieces. And once they go to the complicated pieces, we'll come back to sports watches. So I can't really say there is a specific trend, because once again, the market has gone in so many different directions. You have the sports, you have the small independents that nobody's heard of, you have the designs. But there's one thing which I think will not change, is the search of rarity and the search for quality. And that it's been like that forever, and I don't see it changing anytime soon.
If you're right, time will tell. Thank you, Alexander, for being on the podcast.
Pontus, thank you so much for having me. Time flew by. It was fantastic talking with you.
It did.
Thank you so much for your interest.
Great. To keep up with the latest trends and receive weekly updates on the art and auction world, subscribe to our newsletter on barnabys.com or read Barnabys magazine online.